Ladies and gentlemen, the show is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome from the Musqueam Nation, Audrey Siegel.
Hello, everybody, and first let me start again how I usually start things by saying Haitsepka. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being part of the change that we all need and that our ancestors are pushing for and that our future generations require. So, tight timeline today. I'm going to do my best to stick to it. Meetsap kwatquilam atanash with mathguimach tamoch tanawel. Ike when squalowens quincy quitsnala. Schlem tanat qunisquich tanitsanat humathguim. Lama huikta nitzlina August ktanasit lash. Welcome to the traditional unceded lands of the Musqueam people. My name is Schlem Tanat. I am the granddaughter of the late Stephen and Selena August, and it gives me feelings of great joy to be here with you today. I support Naomi. I support this documentary. I support everybody who is using all of their resources and all of their energy to do what they can to just what I said, be that change. Because it is possible. 3 years ago today, the women in my community, we organized. And we went to one of our most sacred sites called Tsnam, Unearthed Ancestors, story we all know. Building going up, story we all know. We were successful after over 200 days of standing 24/7 vigil over those ancestors, negotiating, building networks, connecting with people on a human level, reminding people that this could just as easily be your ancestors. And people came of their own volition to us. And now, not only did we save those ancestors, but we own that property, and those ancestors are now safe. So the work that is included in this movie, the work that Naomi did to make this happen, and everyone who worked with her to make it happen, I say Haitsepka, and everybody here know it is possible. We will make the changes and be the changes, and we will have the world that our ancestors needed for us over 10,000 years ago here. So I would love to invite you all to sing with me. I'm going to sing a song probably lots of you know. I would love for you to clap with me. I sing this song for Naomi, but I sing this song more specifically for all of the life givers. I sing this song for the warrior women on the front line. I sing this song for the warrior women who came before us so that we could exist. It's the Women's Warrior Song. 30 years ago, a song that came to Martina Pierre in a sweat, a song to be sung for strength, never in anger. So I ask you, let's sing this song for strength for ourselves, for each other, and for the future generations. Please join me, sing, clap, and let's get this night off to an amazing start. Hey, 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 yeah, he, yo, yeah, he, yo, hey, hey, yeah, he, yo, yeah, he, yo, hey, hey, yeah, he, yo. Hey, 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 yeah, he,
Thank you, Audrey. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Laurie Anderson, and I'm the Executive Director of SFU's Vancouver campus. And it's my honor tonight to welcome all of you to this event on behalf of Simon Fraser University. Tonight is a very special edition of what we call the SFU Vancouver Speaker Series. And it's one of the, which itself, the Vancouver Speaker Series, is itself one of the many, many ways in which Simon Fraser University commits itself to being Canada's most engaged university under the leadership of our president, Andrew Petter, who's sitting right here. And this particular event tonight is a collaborative effort involving the Vancouver campus, SFU's Office of Community Engagement, our Department of Philosophy, and SFU's Public Square. I think I'm trying to see how many times I can say SFU in 2 minutes here tonight. I want to take this opportunity to publicly thank my colleagues who made tonight happen. First of all, Am Johal, Professor Sam Black, and finally, Janet Weber and the great team from SFU's Public Square, who did all the heavy lifting to make tonight happen. So thank you. And what an event we have for you. We have a capacity crowd, or soon will have, for what will be, in the tradition of SFU, a truly engaging evening. So let me now introduce our moderator for tonight's event, my colleague, Shauna Sylvester. Shauna is the director of Simon Fraser University's Centre for Dialogue and executive director of SFU's Public Square, which is the signature initiative of the university as it commits to community engagement. Shauna is a skilled facilitator, a social entrepreneur, and a commentator on urban and international issues. Shauna has founded a number of organizations, including Carbon Talks and Renewable Cities, two initiatives focused on accelerating the transition to a low-carbon economy. In 2007, she worked with 15 post-secondary institutions as the founding executive director of Canada's World, a national citizen engagement initiative on foreign policy. She also worked for 10 years as the co-founder and executive director of IMPACTS, the Institute for Media Policy and Civil Society, an organization that operated in Canada, in conflict zones and post-conflict zones around the world. Please join me in welcoming our moderator for this evening, Shauna Sylvester.
Thank you, Laurie. Hello, hello. I'm going to ask the house lights to come up. It is wonderful to be here. I'm hoping I can see you in just a few minutes because I want to start by getting to know a bit about who's in the audience. So how many of you have not read anything of Naomi Klein, have not actually seen her speak, have not seen videos, and you might have come because, you know, your girlfriend's mother dragged you here. So how many of you are here that this is new for you? Okay, I want to say a very, very big welcome to you. It's great to have you here. The second thing I want to do is now I want to ask those of you, how many of you have read one of Naomi's books? Just put up your hand. Oh, they're thick. 2 of Naomi's books. Keep your hand up. 3? Oh my goodness, you could be here with me right now. Now I also have a sense that there's a lot of expertise in the room on climate change. So this time I'm going to get you to move a little bit. If you have worked on climate change, please stand up. If you've worked on it for a year, please stand up on climate change. Get a sense of those that have worked on climate change. Okay, remain standing if you have worked on climate change for, say, 1 to 5 years. Okay, remain standing 5 to 10 years. I wish you could see what's happening up at top. There are a lot of people standing. 10 to 20 years. 10 to 20 years. Anyone that has worked for climate change for 20 to 30 years, stay standing. That is great. Wonderful. So there's great expertise in this room. I want to give you a sense of how the night is going to go as people trickle in. We are a completely sold out group today, so if you had one of those tickets, I think there were some people scalping them at some point. So tonight, Naomi's going to come in and speak. She's going to speak for about 45 minutes. And I'm going to follow up in a conversation with Naomi. And the questions have come through a crowdsourcing process. Thanks to our friends at the TAI, there was a survey, and I think that there were hundreds of questions that came in that I scoured through and have developed the questions that I'm going to ask Naomi today. After that, we're going to do an intermission. Naomi's book is for sale, and on the second floor, she is going to be signing, and she'll continue signing until that line is gone. At 9 o'clock, we're back in here for her documentary. And if you haven't seen Avi Lewis and Naomi Klein's documentary, it's wonderful. So I really encourage you to stay. So you've heard enough from me. You're going to hear more from me later. What I'd like to do is introduce the driving force for having Naomi here, and that is Dr. Sam Black. Now, Sam is a professor at Simon Fraser University in our philosophy department, and he comes from Cambridge, and he has had a real interest in how social justice connects to philosophy. And so what I'd like to do is ask Sam to come out. He's as a former vice president of the British Columbia Council for Civil Liberties, the former senator and vice chair of SFU Senate. For many years, he was the executive editor of the Canadian Journal of Philosophy. And he's made this possible by being a part of the President's Dream Colloquium on Justice Beyond National Boundaries. He is the driving force for Naomi being here, and so we'd like Sam to introduce Naomi. Dr. Black.
Naomi Klein is a very special kind of public intellectual, perhaps unique in her ability to galvanize people around moral causes. I got a firsthand taste of her powers a few years ago while teaching a class on climate justice. I gave students the opportunity to discuss a reading of their choice during class. This kind of bottom-up approach in the classroom often has very, very messy results. But not this time. Everyone wanted to read Naomi Klein's book. Reading that book was a sobering experience, but one for which I think all of us were grateful. It's a real pleasure to welcome Naomi Klein. She's an award-winning journalist, syndicated columnist, and author of the international bestsellers, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, No Logo. She is a columnist for The Nation and The Guardian, a member of the board of directors for 350.org, a global grassroots movement to solve the climate crisis, and she's a Puffin Foundation Writing Fellow at the Nation Institute. Her most recent book, the critically acclaimed This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, was the 2014 winner of the Hillary Weston Writers' Trust Prize for Nonfiction and was a New York Times 100 Notable Book of 2014. Now in paperback, it's being translated into 25 languages. The documentary inspired by the book and narrated by Naomi premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival in September 2015 and is now available worldwide. I'd like you to help me welcome Naomi Klein.
Hey. Hi. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Audrey, for welcoming us to unceded Coast Salish territory so powerfully and so beautifully. I'd like to recognize the elders past and present and some of the elders in my own family who are here, my father, Michael Klein, and my mother-in-law, Michelle Landsberg. It is great to be back at the Vogue. This is actually, I think, the first big theater that I ever spoke in long time ago. And I was very nervous then, and I'm still nervous, especially because I can't see you guys. But I just want to thank everybody involved in tonight. I'll say SFU a million times too. The Vancouver Speaker Series, the SFU Public Square, Janet Weber, Shauna, who I'm very much looking forward to talking with later. And I want to thank President Andrew Petter for being here tonight as well. So I am going to talk about the climate crisis. And a couple of you may be thinking, that's silly. Our politicians fixed that last December in Paris at the big climate summit to save the world. Hey guys, where are my slides? Remember I had slides? Yeah, there they are, cheering wildly for themselves. There they are. French President François Hollande, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Look at how happy they are. Look at how sincere. Look at how sincere. Even the media, usually so cynical, they couldn't help get in on the euphoria. Check out some of these headlines. That the deal marks the end of the fossil fuel era. And I'm sure that many of you have noticed all of the gas stations closing in droves, and the fact that our front pages are still crowded with stories about new LNG terminals and new tar sands pipelines. That's all just one big typo. Actually, a few weeks ago, Exxon put out a report on what they consider their medium to long-term prospects, and they said that they believe that the share of the energy market taken up by oil and gas would continue to increase by mid-century, which is strange because if we are going to keep the temperature targets that were set in Paris, we need to be off fossil fuels by mid-century. So why does Exxon think they're still going to be increasing their market share? What is going on? Is what happened in Paris a political breakthrough of epic proportions, or is it an ecological disaster? And the short answer to that is that it's kind of both, in the sense that we have waited so long to do much of anything in the face of this crisis that we now need to do so much so quickly that actually our politicians can do better than they've ever done before, and they can do quite a lot, and it can still add up to an ecological disaster. That is the paradox of the moment we're in. So I want to take a little time to unpack what actually did happen in Paris, what is in that agreement, because there has been so much misinformation about it, and also because I think it is really revealing in terms of what we are up against. And I was thrilled to see how many of you have been involved in climate activism for so long. So what is most significant about the Paris Accord is that the deal pledges to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius while pursuing, quote, efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So in Paris, it was a really big fight to get 1.5 in the agreement. And this is 1.5 warming above pre-industrial levels, right? And this mattered. It matters that it's actually in there, even though the language is quite equivocal. The demand to have the temperature target be 1.5 degrees as opposed to 2 degrees was coming from the parts of the world that are most vulnerable to climate change, that are already experiencing catastrophic impacts. The Philippines being battered by typhoons like Haiyan, coming from places like Bolivia that depend on glaciers that are disappearing for their drinking water, southern African nations who understand that a 2-degree temperature increase translates to 3 to 3.5 degrees in southern Africa and would be a death sentence for the continent, not survivable. Some of the most powerful voices arguing for 1.5 to be in the Paris Accord came from low-lying Pacific Island states that understand that 2 degrees of warming means their countries disappear beneath the waves. 1.5 doesn't guarantee their survival, it gives them a fighting chance. And the slogan of the Pacific Island states has been 1.5 to stay alive. So it gets right to the point. One of the people in Paris who was fighting hardest was a poet named Kathy Jetnil-Kijiner. She's from the Marshall Islands. And you may remember her. I bet a lot of you saw this video that went viral where she made a presentation to the United Nations in New York. And she was holding her baby at the end of it. And it was a poem that she'd written for her daughter. It was just beautiful. And I think we will all recall that it was Canada, of all the industrialized nations, that chose to really stick its neck out and stand with these vulnerable nations, the newly elected Trudeau government, we're back, right? And say 1.5 should be in the text. So Canada did that. And we got a lot of love for it in Paris, as you can imagine, because of the stakes. And I was reminded of the human stakes of a target like this. You know, you hear lots of numbers when you talk about climate change: 2 degrees, 1.5, 30% reductions, 2040, all of that. It's just this jumble of numbers. But there are so many people behind these numbers. And yesterday, Kathy tweeted, this was her tweet: "High tides have hit the Marshall Islands again. This is our seawall getting beat up. Climate change, hashtag 1.5 to stay alive." So it's good that 1.5 is in the Paris Accord. It's about nothing less than saying that these countries, these people, these ancient cultures have a right to exist, have a right to life. The alternative is genocidal. Let's not mince words. That's why a lot of people were cheering, because that was in the Accord, that is in the Accord. And it's also why we saw those over-the-top headlines in places like The Guardian, that this marked the end of the fossil fuel era. The reason for that is that if we are serious about these targets, it does actually mean the end of fossil fuels. It means that the vast majority of known fossil fuel reserves have to stay in the ground, and particularly dirty fossil fuels like the Alberta tar sands. For them, it means that 90% of it has to stay in the ground for 2 degrees, certainly for 1.5. There is no room for tar sands expansion within the carbon budget for either 2 degrees or 1.5. So here's the bad news. The same governments that set these targets simultaneously declared themselves completely unwilling to do the things necessary to meet those targets. Now, this takes a little unpacking and a little bit more UN jargon. So the way this process worked was that rather than telling governments what their share of the carbon budget was, that was deemed overly top-down, the way the UN is now working when it comes to climate change is that countries are told to just come up with their own targets, their own nationally determined plans. These are called INDCs, and then bring them to the negotiations. So they set the target, 1.5 to 2 degrees, but then if you added up all of the national plans that every country brought to Paris, including Canada, including the US and China and all the major economies, it doesn't add up to either 1.5 or 2 degrees warming. It adds up to 3 to 4 degrees of warming. So 4 degrees of warming at the start of This Changes Everything, I quote Kevin Anderson, leading climate scientist, former director of the Tyndall Center on Climate Change Research in Manchester, England. He describes 4 degrees of warming as incompatible with any reasonable characterization of an organized, equitable, and civilized global community. So that's what the plans add up to. So what we have in Paris is a pretty good definition of safety, 1.5 to 2 degrees, and a concrete plan for disaster, what all the governments brought to the table. Our leaders have said to us in broad daylight, we know what we need to do, and we are willing to do roughly half that. And this is actually acknowledged in the text. It is noted with serious concern that there is this gap between plans and targets. And they have a plan for how to bridge this gap. The plan is that they are going to meet every 5 years, take stock, and hope that things have changed for the better. Like, who knows? Maybe Donald Trump will be willing to make deeper emission cuts. That is less funny every day. Now, it's actually even more worrying than that, because I mentioned that these nationally determined plans are called INDCs in UN jargon, and the I in INDCs is for intended, meaning these are not binding agreements. This is just what governments say they intend to do. They can break those plans at will. There are no repercussions, no fines, no threats of trade sanctions, like if you break a trade agreement. So if that's the case, why not break them? And the truth is that unless something radical changes, Canada is on track to break the paltry commitments that we brought to Paris. We brought to Paris the commitments made by the Harper government, and we are set to blow past them. During the US elections, all of the Republican candidates are promising to break the pledges made by Obama and do away with his Clean Power Plan, so-called Clean Power Plan. So what this means is that we're not actually on the road to 1.5, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, or 4 degrees. If we stay on the road we're actually on, which is in all the climate modeling is called business as usual, if we just keep on doing what we're doing, that actually leads us to a world of 6 degrees warming Celsius. So it's important to understand just how dangerous that road is. We have so far warmed the planet by 1 degree Celsius. And this is what that road looked like last Saturday in the Northwest Territories. So that is a tanker truck. Some of you may have seen the story. It's a tanker truck carrying fuel dropping through the ice. I repeat, a truck carrying oil falling through the ice that is melting very quickly because of the stuff in the truck. Now, of course, none of the news reports mention the relationship between the cargo and the ice melting. In fact, none of the news stories even mention climate change. So this is what 1 degree warming looks like in Canada's north. It looks very different in different parts of the world. This is a very disturbing slide, I should warn you. This past summer, in India and Pakistan, there was a heat wave that killed thousands of people. That the Indian government linked directly to climate change. The morgues in Karachi ran out of space. So if this is what 1 degree looks like, and we have a deal that allows us to stay on a road to 6 degrees, you can understand why a lot of people weren't cheering at the end of the signing of that accord, why James Hansen, perhaps the world's most respected climate scientist, called the deal a fraud, a fake, really. What Paris made clear is that we are making progress in naming the problem, but our politicians are still not ready to make the hard choices necessary to avoid catastrophic warming. That's why they felt free to go home after Paris and fight against a carbon tax in the case of Saskatchewan's Premier Brad Wall, or make a plan for the tar sands that would allow a massive increase in production in the case of Alberta's Rachel Notley, or push for new tar sands pipelines in the case of both of those premiers as well as our Prime Minister. So I want to be clear. Trudeau is actually doing some very good stuff on climate. Yesterday in Washington, he and Obama made some important announcements about methane emissions and Arctic protection. Alberta's government is also introducing some strong climate policies, particularly on the coal phase-out. But all of this good is undone by the absurd and dangerous idea that these actions somehow purchase a license to build massive new pipelines and expand tar sand productions. They do not, because the science is clear and the numbers don't add up. New pipelines like Energy East and pipeline expansions like Trans Mountain are intimately tied to significant increases in production. They also lock us in to this dangerous model, lock us onto that road for decades into the future, because you don't spend $15.7 billion building a new pipeline, which is the current price tag for Energy East, and it keeps going up, if you don't intend that pipeline to stay in production for 30 to 40 years. Same goes for the LNG terminals that Christy Clark is so desperate to build in this province. You don't sink billions of dollars unless it's going to last past the point that we need to be off fossil fuels, and that's why we can't let them build it. So, now, if there's one thing we know about Justin Trudeau, it's that he wants everyone to like him. There he is. He wants to say yes to everything, right? We can have windmills and pipelines, he told audiences in this city last week. Pipelines and pandas. Well, he didn't say that, but we can pretend. He actually did say we can use the pipelines to pay for the windmills. Maybe 15 years ago, not today. Not if we have any intention of making good on the pledges we made in Paris. Pledges that mean survival to people like Kathy and her daughter in the Marshall Islands. Listen, Stephen Harper, at least he didn't pretend to care. He said, we're going to put our economy first, screw the rest of you. But these liberals, they raised hopes. They lapped up all that love. And to treat these pledges as if they can be broken so casually, well, frankly, that is a moral abomination, and we cannot let them do it. They said 1.5, we are going to keep them to it. It is not good enough to rebrand Stephen Harper's climate criminality, paint it green so we feel better about ourselves. We need to bury that legacy once and for all alongside a whole lot of carbon that's got to stay in the ground. And that is precisely what movements across Turtle Island, around the world, are trying to do. We're trying to hold them to it. Shell learned this the hard way when they were bringing their Arctic drilling rig up to Alaska last spring, and they stopped in Seattle for some maintenance and were greeted by the kayaktivists. And because the incredible Audrey Siegel welcomed us tonight, let's remember just how awesome she is. That's Audrey. A few months later, Shell announced it was pulling out of the Arctic for the foreseeable future. Now, Blockadia doesn't just have one drilling rig surrounded. It has every major fossil fuel project on the continent surrounded. And in every single one of these fights, First Nations are leading the way, and women are on the front lines. That's Amanda Polkes, confronting the RCMP during the Elsipogtog standoff. And this is an image closer to home, the Burnaby Mountain protests against Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain expansion. I think there are even a couple of jailbirds in the audience here tonight. So, of course, many of these key battles they're playing out in the streets, the mountains, on the water, in the woods, and they're also playing out in the courts. Yesterday, we learned that the Inuit community of Clyde River, which has been fighting against Arctic drilling and seismic testing, they are going to be able to take their case all the way up to the Supreme Court. And we also learned on the same day that the Chippewas of the Thames in Ontario, who are really the last line of defense against the building of Line 9, they are also going to be able to take their appeal to the Supreme Court. So it's been a big couple of days. And there's another front on which we are trying to keep that carbon in the ground, and that is divestment. The past 2 years, fossil fuel divestment. The past 2 years has seen an exponential growth in this movement. Over 500 institutions with assets worth $3.4 trillion have committed to various degrees of divestment from fossil fuels. Universities, cities, towns, churches, foundations, Oxford, Stanford, University of Glasgow. Unfortunately, we don't yet have a major Canadian university to add to the list. We are behind. Now, didn't we say SFU a few times at the beginning of this? So I just want to say, I want to give a big shout out to the good folks at Divest SFU who are working really, really hard on this. They've been making some important progress, and anyone here who wants to get involved, link up with SFU 350. Check them out at sfu350.com. This is .org.com. You'll find it. So, divestment is linked to this because the whole reason why we are calling for divestment is because we know that fossil fuel companies have at least 5 times more carbon in their proven reserves than is compatible with 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. So this is all complementary, and we believe that when the social license is eroded for these companies, that it creates a situation where it is easier to regulate them, easier to tax them. If we delegitimize these profits, then it is only fair that we get a greater share of those profits to pay for the transition off of fossil fuels. So I want to talk a little bit about what got me to this topic, because those of you, who have been reading my books for a while know that I came a little late to this. I focused my work for most of my adult life on human rights, environmental justice, wars. And to be honest with you, I told myself that climate change was kind of like the one big issue that I didn't have to care about. It wasn't that I denied that it existed. I just thought other people were dealing with it, and I was dealing with things that were more immediate. That was the story I told myself. And my wake-up call came a little bit more than 10 years ago. I was working on the shock doctrine, and I was in New Orleans, and it was underwater. So I want to talk a little bit about Katrina. I know many of you have heard me talk about it before, but I think it's really important because this road we're on doesn't just lead to warmer weather, hotter weather, wetter weather. It leads to Katrina. So what you have to remember about Katrina is that this disaster was not just about heavy weather, a big storm. Katrina was a huge storm, Category 5 hurricane, of the kind we're going to see more of as oceans warm. But the storm had been downgraded to a tropical storm by the time it reached New Orleans. So what turned it into a catastrophe was the fact that that heavy weather collided with a weak and neglected public sphere. Not just the physical levees, but every level of government was completely dysfunctional and abandoned the people of New Orleans. So we had what is fair to describe as disaster apartheid. Because if you had money, and in New Orleans that generally meant if you were white, you got into your car, you drove out of the city, you called your insurance broker, checked into a motel. But if there needed to be an evacuation plan, if there needed to be some sort of functioning response, well, you were abandoned on the rooftop. You were abandoned in the Superdome. It took FEMA, the Federal Disaster Agency, 5 days, it seemed, to find New Orleans. People were left without food and water. So you had heavy weather meets weak and neglected public sphere, and over it all, institutionalized racism, because then the people who had been abandoned were attacked, vilified, monsterized, called animals on Fox News, called looters when they went and looked for food for themselves. I was in the city in this period, and there were white vigilantes with guns looking for black people to shoot after curfew. It was completely terrifying. So this is what I mean by this is not just about things getting hotter. It's about things getting meaner, unless there is something radical that changes about the values that govern our society. And it didn't end there, right? After the shock of the storm came the shock doctrine. This is a Republican congressman named Richard Baker, who said we couldn't clean out the housing projects, but God did, by which he meant that by this point, the city had been evacuated, and people weren't able to protect their homes. And these were not idle words. Much of the housing, public housing in New Orleans, even housing that was not damaged in the storm because it was on higher ground, but was on desirable pieces of real estate, was demolished, replaced with housing that looked like this, and you can imagine that it was not the same people who moved in. It was not just housing. There was a war waged on the public sphere in New Orleans, even though it was the failure of the public sphere that so intensified the catastrophe. New Orleans today has the most privatized school system in the United States. 94% of public schools were shut down, teachers fired, contracts broken, and reopened as charter schools. This is Charity Hospital, the largest downtown hospital serving low-income people. That picture was taken last year because Charity Hospital has still not been reopened. So this is what scares me, not just the weather, right? We have a system that produces more and more and bigger shocks. Market shocks, you deregulate the financial markets, you get bubbles, they burst, like in 2008. We have military shocks over wars fought over natural resources, very often oil, the very thing causing climate change, and now we have increasingly regular climate shocks. And unless something radically changes, then each one of these shocks will be used, as I described in the shock doctrine, to push us further apart, to leave a more privatized, more corporatized world of a tiny group of winners and a great many locked out people. And isn't this the story we tell ourselves every time we go see some science fiction movie like The Hunger Games, where the story is always the same? And it's so hard, actually, to imagine another story, that facing crisis, we might actually come together and build a fairer society. And after I published the shock doctrine, the first place I presented the book was New Orleans. And during the discussion, a great labor organizer there named Saket Soni, who was organizing migrant workers in New Orleans who had been brought in and were facing abusive conditions in the reconstruction of the city, he said, "They have disaster capitalism, we need disaster collectivism." What he was saying is there has to be a progressive response to crisis that is the antithesis of the shock doctrine, that is the antithesis of just using the crisis to push through policies that make us more crisis prone, that make the problem worse. We need to respond to crisis with solutions that actually keep the shocks from coming, that make us more stable, that bring us together. And the truth is there are many examples of this throughout history, where crisis actually produces positive progressive change. And what I found when I was writing the shock doctrine is that the right understood this, and the whole shock doctrine strategy was devised to make sure that shocks, which lend themselves to progressive change because they so often are pointing to a failure in the system, do not become moments when progressive victories advance. And we know that this can happen through Canadian history. It was in the context of post-World War II suffering, a war that took so many Canadian lives, that Tommy Douglas introduced universal hospital insurance in Saskatchewan in 1947. That radical idea eventually was turned into universal health care. It was in the aftermath of the market crash of 1929, in the midst of the Great Depression, that the New Deal was possible. Huge investments in the public sphere to create jobs, stimulate the economy, accompanied by aggressive regulation to rein in the banks. Far from perfect. Huge problems with the New Deal legislation. And we must never forget that. But this is when much of the contemporary public sphere and social safety net were born. Another example, the Santa Barbara oil spill in 1969 gave birth to Earth Day. And this was a devastating disaster, kind of like the Deepwater Horizon of its day, fouled some of the US's most beautiful beaches. But it paved the way for a wave of environmental legislation, not just in the US, but in Canada too, because people looked at this and said, we can never let this happen again. We need to get at the root. A more recent example from 5 years ago, the Fukushima disaster. Well, in Germany, a mobilized environmental movement saw what happened with Fukushima and said, we need to get off nukes and we need to get off fossil fuels. We want to get to 100% renewables way faster than we're doing it now. And Germany is in the midst of the most rapid energy transformation anywhere in the world. They're getting 30% of their electricity from renewables in the summer, much more. Much of those renewables are decentralized. They've created 400,000 jobs. They've reversed energy privatizations in hundreds of cities and towns. So we need this kind of shift at a global scale. But what is going to be our catalyst? I mean, the good news is that the time for a transition like this has never been better. The price of renewables is dropping, efficiency is getting better, battery power is getting better. We have research out of Stanford University led by Mark Jacobson that shows exactly how country by country, including Canada, how we can get to 100% renewables for electricity in 2 decades for all of our needs by mid-century. So the scientists are saying we have to do it. The engineers are saying we can do it. But what is going to be our catalyst? It doesn't seem like it's going to be climate change, not in a country that likes warm winters as much as we do. Maybe this is going to do it. This is a graph about the price of oil. In 18 months, we've seen the price of oil go from a peak of $100 to $30. That is a true shock, and it is already reshaping our country. Jim Prentice and Stephen Harper lost their jobs because of it. Investors are pulling out of big fossil fuel projects in droves, LNG terminals, and of course the tar sands. Now, the human suffering in the face of this shock is enormous. In Alberta, of course, but coast to coast, all over this province, kids are going to school hungry because their parents, who had a contract job, no severance, lost their job overnight. They're carrying huge mortgages, and there's a massive amount of shame just to admit, but people are going hungry because of this shock. For a long time, Canadians were told by our government that we had to choose between a growing economy and a healthy environment. We couldn't have both. That's what Stephen Harper told us. And a lot of people chose the economy, chose the jobs. That was then. We now find ourselves in a very different moment. Now we have neither a healthy environment nor a healthy economy. We have sacrificed far too much. We have fallen too many trees. We have poisoned too many rivers. We have broken too many treaties. And now the price of oil has collapsed. We don't have the growth or the jobs either. The workers in whose names so much was sacrificed are themselves being sacrificed by those very same companies. And make no mistake, this is a shock to our system, and it begs for a bold response. There has to be a strategy to create jobs, to revive the economy, to keep it from going into free fall. And you know, there's the moment we're in actually has a lot of similarities with 2009, when Obama came to power, with a decisive democratic mandate for change, revive Main Street, act on climate change. He had that mandate. He also had the ability to write a very large stimulus bill. It ended up being around $800 billion. The auto companies and the banks had also bankrupted themselves, massive bailouts for both. So, you know, in the book I talk about, imagine if his administration had been willing to use that mandate to bring together the auto bailout, the bank bailout, the stimulus bill, to really remake the economy in a way that brought down emissions, created huge numbers of jobs. What if all of these pieces were brought together? The stimulus package could have been used to build the best public transit system and smart grids in the world. The auto industry could have been dramatically re-engineered so that the factories built the machinery to power the transition, not just a few token electric cars, though those too, but also streetcars and high-speed rail for an underserved nation. But that's not what Obama decided to do with that extraordinary power. Instead, he treated the stimulus kind of like those heart defibrillators at the hospital where you try to revive a dying patient with electric shocks. Just throw money and try to revive them. And that's what happened. The banks were able to get back to work and business as usual, pretty much unchanged. The car companies were able to do the same thing except for laying off more than 100,000 workers. And the massive stimulus bill emphasized so-called shovel-ready projects, right? So the idea was just to get the money out the door as fast as you can, which doesn't lend itself to a thoughtful, planned approach. So there were some good green energy projects funded by the stimulus for sure, but transit was completely shortchanged, and the single biggest winner of the stimulus bill was the car culture, was highways and bridges, was doubling down on the fossil fuel economy. And it's really, really important to understand what a lost opportunity this was, because we're getting another chance right now in Canada, because we are in the process of designing a very large stimulus, or the Trudeau government is. We are also talking about some pretty big bailouts, and we need to make the right decisions this time. So I want to give a few examples of wrong decisions, okay? Christy Clark wants to use the federal stimulus to pay for a 10-lane bridge to replace the Massey Tunnel. This is exactly the same mistake they made in the States. She even has the guts to market this as green infrastructure, despite the fact that all of the research shows that when you build really big bridges and really big roads, people drive more cars and fill them up really fast. Another example, and this has received almost no press in Canada, I read about it in Bloomberg News, the Export Development Canada has announced that it's going to provide as much as $750 million in emergency loans to oil and gas companies. We're bailing out the oil and gas companies to the tune of $750 million on top of $400 million that the Harper government gave them last year because of the oil shock, okay? So we're throwing money at the very people who are responsible for what is happening right now. And then there's Bombardier, right? It looks like Bombardier is going to be getting a bailout worth $3.5 billion. If you combine what Quebec is giving them, they're giving $1 billion, then Quebec Pension Fund is giving them 1.5, and the ask to the federal government is for another $1 billion. So this is also a fossil fuel bailout, because we aren't bailing out just any part of Bombardier. Bombardier makes a lot of things, including high-speed trains, which they sell to Europe, not in Canada. So we are bailing out Bombardier's troubled commercial jet division, its highest carbon division. Another example of a fossil fuel bailout. And then there's Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall, who asked last week for $156 million from the federal government to pay laid-off oil and gas workers to clean up abandoned wells. And petroleum producers in Alberta thought that this was a very good idea, and they're planning on making their own ask for the same bailout. Now, my people have a word for this. It is chutzpah. We are talking about a sector that has extracted untold billions of profits from this country thanks to absurdly low royalty rates and lax regulations. Big players are still earning huge profits from their global operations, and this is stolen land as well, keep in mind. They can damn well pay for their own cleanup without us bailing them out. And if they refuse, we should seize their assets and use them to power the transition off fossil fuels. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't spend money. We should spend money. But let's insist that every new public dollar has to do two things. It has to be part of a plan to dramatically lower emissions, and it has to fight inequality, systemic inequality in this country. So one good start would be to stop calling it an economic stimulus. Let's call it an economic catalyst. The old economy at war with both people and the planet is flatlining. How's this for a directive? Do not resuscitate. Reimagine, reinvent, leap to the next economy. So I want to spend the rest of my time with you talking about leaping. I want to talk about a wonderful experience that I've been a part of over the last few months called the LEAP Manifesto. Have any of you signed the LEAP Manifesto? I hope you've signed the LEAP Manifesto. And if you haven't, you can read it and hopefully sign it at leapmanifesto.org. So this was a process that grew out of a meeting that was held in Toronto last May. It had participants from across the country, including people in this room like Harsha Walia and Melina Labucan-Massimo, and probably other people who I don't know are here. And that meeting was called From Oil Shock to Energy Shift. It was about how we can harness this economic crisis for a real transformation of our society, of our economy that solves multiple problems at the same time. It is not about saying climate is a bigger crisis than racism, climate is a bigger crisis than fighting poverty. First we'll save the planet, then we'll do everything else. It is about throwing that mentality out the window and looking for integrated solutions. Integrated solutions that fight inequality and racism and patriarchy and lower emissions at the same time. And I'm not saying that this document is perfect, but it is definitely a conversation starter. And what we realized when we got together is that we don't have a lot of spaces where we can talk about what we want. You know, there have been terrific coalitions in this country where we come together to agree that we're against something, right? Like we are against the TPP. We are against Stephen Harper. But there's not a lot of places to get together and say, but what do we want? Because the status quo is not good enough. So my role in this gathering was mainly to listen and bring out some of the themes. And some of the themes that came out of this meeting were very, very clear. It was about the need to shift from an economy based on endless extraction, as if there are no limits. Not just extraction from the earth, but extracting from the connective tissue of our societies, pushing the safety net beyond the breaking point, and also extracting from bodies, the way labor is treated, as if there is no limit to how far bodies can be pushed. Moving from a society based on that endless taking to a society that values at its very center caretaking, taking care of one another and taking care of the planet. So the document that we came up with, the LEAP Manifesto, has now been signed by more than 200 Canadian organizations, including many trade unions, tens of thousands of you guys, amazing artists like Leonard Cohen and Jan Martel. And you know, I want to talk a little bit about the name. We worked with some wonderful artists, as Angela Sterrett's poster. Now, if you read the National Post, you would have the impression that we were inspired by Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward, and this is why we chose the name The Leap. And this is actually not true, because Mao's industrial policy was actually called the War Against Nature, so that was not what inspired us. The reason why we chose the name is actually because we realized that 2016, when we would be pushing for this, because we thought there might be a new government, is a leap year. And we realized that leap years are a great metaphor for this great transformation that we need to make. Because every 4 years, we do this weird thing of adding an extra day to our calendar because our human-created system for measuring time in the Western world is actually flawed. It does not match up. It does not sync up with the Earth's revolution around the sun. So it was Julius Caesar who first realized that it was easier to tack on a day, i.e. change a human-created system, than it was to change the laws of nature. And so we sort of felt like, well, if economists could understand that, then we would be in a much better situation. So that's why it is called the LEAP, in case you were wondering. And one of the key demands of the LEAP Manifesto is for energy democracy, inspired by the model of Germany. So calling, as we shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy, that we don't just want to go from Exxon selling us fossil fuels to Exxon selling us solar panels. We want a more democratic economy. So we want communities to be able to own and control their own renewable energy projects. But we decided to go further than Germany in calling not just for energy democracy, but for energy justice and really energy reparations, which is why the LEAP states that Indigenous people and others on the front lines of industrial activity should be first to receive public support for their own clean energy projects. Now, this demand did not come out of thin air. It came out of the fact that in Indigenous communities, this is already happening. And when we launched the LEAP, we were very happy to be able to launch a video of a project, and this is just a still from it. This is Little Buffalo, and this is Lubicon Cree territory in the heart of the tar sands, where this is a community that was the site of one of the largest on-land pipeline disasters in Canadian history. It's been devastated by oil and gas extraction, and they've brought community solar to the heart of the tar sands. And Melina Labucan Massimo is here tonight, so I just want to ask you to bring up the house lights, because Melina was the driving force for this project. Melina, will you stand up? This is what the Leap is all about. Is she here somewhere? There she is. Hey, Melina. And if you want to find out more about or watch a fantastic video about this, you can go to lubiconsolar.ca. So this is, there's a solar project that's recently been launched in Fort Chip. Beaver Lake Cree Nation is also working on community solar. And there are many examples of this, but what we learn is that it is being left to these communities who are owed a tremendous debt already to fundraise for these projects, to go to foundations, to launch, online fundraising drives, and to divert funds from much needed services to pay for this. And so what we're saying is that this should be policy across the country. It should be taxpayer dollars that go first to First Nations communities to own and control their own renewable energy. And to other frontline communities as well that are already bearing the toxic burden in their communities, in their bodies, of our dependence on fossil fuels. The LEAP calls for a transformation of our agriculture system. Another point of unity is the crisis in our treatment of migrants and refugees. The LEAP acknowledges our roles in the wars, trade deals, and climate disasters that are collectively driving so many people from their lands, which is why it calls for full rights for all workers, regardless of immigration status, as well as. So I'm not going to go through the whole manifesto, but the other thing we obviously talk about is that we need to invest in high-speed rail and efficiency and renewable energy and create huge numbers of so-called green jobs. The CCPA has crunched the numbers on this. We create 6 to 8 times more jobs when we invest in those sectors than when we invest in oil and gas. So we should not be bailing out the airline division of Bombardier, but we should be investing in rail across this country. But in addition to this, right, we wanted to redefine what a green job is, because yes, those are green jobs and we can create lots of them, but we often ignore low carbon work that is already happening in our economy. It's overwhelmingly done by women, much of it done by immigrant women. It's some of the most undervalued and unpaid work in our economy, and that's the work of caregiving, of caring for people. And there's lots of other low-carbon work that isn't recognized as such: social work, teaching, the arts, public interest media. So we're calling for a big expansion of that. And we know it sounds expensive, which is why we want to go to where the money is. And we worked with the CCPA on an accompanying document called We Can Afford to Leap, calling for an end to fossil fuel subsidies, financial transaction taxes, all of this, cuts to military spending, not just a carbon tax, but a progressive carbon tax, and one that is much higher, I'm afraid, than you have in this province. So the principle is very simple. The principle is polluter pays. And there's a lot more. Please read it. What's been amazing is that despite the fact that it is a very ambitious document calling for a national debate on a guaranteed annual income, calling for us to renegotiate all of our trade deals so that they don't stand in the way of relocalizing our economies and taking bold climate action, and we certainly can't be signing new deals like the TPP. Despite this, it's just been taken up across the country. And I just want to give one example of the way it's been taken up. One of the first unions to sign the LEAP was the postal workers. And as we all know, the post office in this country, postal service in this country, is very much under threat. There's a review going on, and everything is on the table, including closing many, many post offices, privatizing large parts of the service. And as we know, the Harper government wanted to do away with home delivery altogether. So what's exciting is that the postal workers are not responding to this by just saying, no, we want things to stay exactly the way they are. On Leap Day, the postal workers put out their plan. We worked closely with them. They put out a plan for how to reinvent the post office as a hub for a just green transition, as a hub for this economy based on caring for one another and caring for the earth. They point out quite rightly that there are more post offices than there are Tim Hortons. So we have this incredible network, a brick and mortar network across the country in almost every community except for where it's been shut down. Let's use it. Let's make it more relevant. So the plan for the post office of the future, and I think many of you have on your seats a little flyer about this, because we want you to support it and participate in the review and say, this is what we want the post office to be. We want people to be able to charge their electric vehicles out front. We want the postal fleet to be electric vehicles made in Canada. We want solar panels on the roof. We think that they can deliver more than the mail. They can deliver locally grown food, and then they can also check in on the elderly and be part of this network of building stronger communities. They can do postal banking. So that they're fighting payday loan sharks, and also being a place where you can go to get a loan and advice to start your own community-controlled renewable energy projects. So this is the spirit of it, and it's so exciting to see this happening. On Leap Day, there were events around the world, from Slovenia to the Bronx, where people got together. This is an event that was in Vancouver, a CUPE rally. There's Audrey again. There's something about Audrey. She just photographs very well, it seems. These are a bunch of kids in Nelson, BC, who had this rally on the day that Trudeau took office. They had a 24-hour sit-in on Leap Day. They are ready to leap, and they want Trudeau to follow. So I think what all of this is showing is that people understand that even though we're told all the time that, oh, well, we have to be satisfied with this, half-baked policy because we know it's not good enough, but it's a step in the right direction, right? We know Paris isn't good enough, but it's a step in the right direction. Here's the thing. When you are faced with a chasm between where you are and where you need to go, a step in the right direction is not going to end well. People know it. Our politicians may fear transformative change, but a great many of us are ready for it. The system is failing us on multiple levels. How else can we explain the fact that an avowed democratic socialist is making a credible run for US president right now, or a pope? I just like this, because who would have thought these 70-something guys would be the rock stars in 2016? A whole lot of us understand that we have gone so far off course, time is so short, and that we now have to go for it on all fronts. At this late hour, with so much to lose and so much to gain, now is not the time for small steps. Now is the time for boldness. Now is the time to leap. Thank you.
Come join me. Just a few small ideas there, right? It's the time to leap. I want to start there. And I want to ask you if you can name this moment. If you go back and look at public attitudes to climate change, we go back to late 80s when we really learned that climate change from scientists was human-made. Yeah. We had the Rio Summit, and many of us that were involved were very galvanized at that point. The low point being Copenhagen. And now we're at Paris, and we've had our ministerial. If you can name this moment in terms of, you talk about we're ready. Have we reached that critical mass? Are we at a tipping point?
The way I would describe the moment is that you can't, oh, okay, I've got my lav mic. Okay, they just needed to turn it on. All right, it's on. All right. So
Thank you.
I don't think we're there. I don't think we're where we need to be. But I would say that many of the pieces are there, but the pieces aren't connected. Okay. So I mean, you talked about the late 1980s. The argument I make in the book is that that climate change suffered from this tragic case of bad timing, where there was all of this readiness, but if you look at it in retrospect, this was the ascendant moment for the neoliberal project. 1988, that's when Hansen testifies on Capitol Hill. That's the year that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is formed. It's also the year that Canada and the US signed the first free trade agreement. It's the year before the Berlin Wall collapses. So all of that excitement all of that energy and goodwill gets undercut by the logic of market fundamentalism, which is completely at odds with what we need to do. I mean, look at what I was just talking about. We need to invest in the public sphere. We've been clawing it back. We didn't believe in the public sphere. We need to tax polluters, but we're lowering taxes. We're deregulating instead of regulating. So we had this clash. So when I say that a lot of things are in place, it matters that the neoliberal project is in crisis, right? And that's where I think, I'm not saying that Bernie Sanders is the savior. I don't believe that. I think he's a deeply flawed politician, but I think he is an expression of a deep understanding that this is a systemic failure. I think that so is Black Lives Matter. So is the Fight for 15. So is the fact that socialists have been elected to city council in Seattle, right? So it's not just Bernie, but there's ideological room for alternatives now, and that's incredibly important if we're going to respond. And there are a lot of mobilized communities, and this is why I think projects like the Leap Matter, we still aren't telling a common story, right? We still aren't connecting the dots nearly well enough. And this is the great flaw of the Sanders campaign, is that it's way too white. It has failed, and I say this as somebody, I would really, really want him to beat Hillary Clinton, okay? But if he doesn't, it will be because of a failure to connect the dots. So I think that the combination of that ideological collapse of the neoliberal project, the fact that there is a great deal more awareness of climate change, and the fact that there's a growth in many different social movements, including indigenous sovereignty and rights. And so, can we connect the dots? Can we get out of silos? Can we tell a narrative, a common story that builds a really fighting movement,
I'm going to ask you, let's go to the US. Because while there might be a collapse of neoliberalism, certainly the rise of Trump, I think many of us might have found that amusing at the beginning, and now are looking on in horror. And I want to go back to your doctrine, the shock doctrine. Can we make a relationship between the rise of the support for Trump and climate change? Is there a shock going on that we're numb to and need a strongman for?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I'm trying to understand why there are so many people that want Trump.
Well,
Is it that they want an authoritarian because they can't face what's coming at them?
I think they want scapegoats, right? I think there's anger. There's a huge amount of anger out there, and there's a lot to be angry about, right? And I think that this sort of moment where you've got Bernie and Trump out there, it's very stark, right? Where because both of them actually have made money in politics the centerpiece of their campaign, right? So Bernie says, "Trust me, because I'm not going to take money from big corporations and the 1%." And Trump says, "You can trust me because I'm so rich, I don't need their money," right? But it's a really important part of his campaign, and both of them are speaking to an anger, and Sanders is saying, this anger should be directed at the system, it should be directed at elites, and Trump is saying, blame Mexicans, blame Muslims, and it's just like, is this anger going to go up? Is it going to be a systemic critique, or is it going to be this, this fascist, story we have seen so many times? There is a relationship between these two. I mean, if you look at a country like Greece, right, and where, when you have extreme economic hardship. This is a very old story. I mean, this is a situation in which the Nazis flourished in Germany, right? In Greece, you had Golden Dawn, a fascist party, neo-Nazi party, that was flourishing in the midst of this very, very punitive austerity. And it was only when Syriza started to rise and provide a progressive alternative that they went down. But when you have a progressive party that gets backed into a corner and then starts prescribing the same austerity policies, then you see it go back up. So we're in this sort of seesaw moment.
So in the past, you've been critical about environmental groups engaging in electoral politics, and particularly around Obama. Is this a time that environmental groups have to engage in, say, the US election to stop what's happening with Trump? Where is that movement go, the leap forward movement go?
Okay, so I don't believe I've really been critical of environmental groups engaging in electoral politics. I've been critical of environmental groups engaging in this sort of backroom deals that we saw in the first term of Obama's administration, where it was all about getting into a room with coal companies and oil companies and the cap and trade bill was drafted with a small group of big environmental groups and a large group of industry like Chevron, BP, Duke Energy, and they wrote the bill. So I think that it's a terrible model. And but in terms of engaging with electoral politics, I think there has to be some kind of engagement. And the environmental movement is very engaged in this moment, and there's it's not monolithic. But I think that if it ends up being Hillary, it's going to be hard. Like, it's going to be a very hard election for a lot of people if it ends up being Hillary Clinton versus Trump.
Say a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, the history with Hillary is pretty lousy. So it's not. She has some good policies. If you compare her policies with Sanders' policies, he's better. He says no fracking. He says that we shouldn't give any fossil fuel leases on public land. So those are two places where he's clearly better than Hillary. But she has a lot of really good policies. The problem is what she did when she was Secretary of State. She was absolutely ready to rubber stamp Keystone. Her State Department had commissioned the environmental assessments that were just ready to rubber stamp it. So there's that. And there's the fact that I think on climate, there's no reason to believe she would be strong on it, because when she was Secretary of State, she almost never talked about climate change, and was very close to the oil lobby. But, for me, it's, there's been a lot of attention paid to what Bill Clinton did when he was in office in terms of the neoliberal project and deregulating the banks and all of that. And this is important. Mass incarceration, all of it. But I'm actually more interested in what the Clintons have done with their foundation and with the Clinton Global Initiative and this whole model of, sometimes it's called philanthrocapitalism, where if you look at what the Clinton Global Initiative is, it's this place, right, where it's kind of a new model of government where it's all volunteer and you bring together the billionaires with the celebrities, with the governments, and Bill Clinton plays let's make a deal. And then people make these huge announcements about we're going to fix AIDS and we're going to fix water in this country or whatever. And there's absolutely no accountability. In the book I tell this story about Richard Branson, who made this very flashy announcement that he was going to spend all of his profits in transportation and funnel them into solving climate change. And me and my research team were the first people to audit this and find out that he had spent a fraction of what he had promised, and meanwhile he'd increased his fleet of airplanes by 130. And we calculated how much his emissions had gone up in this period. But the point is, he made that announcement at the Clinton Global Initiative. And there's no accountability for any of this. So I actually weirdly think that, people are always talking about how the Republican parties created Trump, he's their Frankenstein. I actually believe that you could make a stronger argument that the Clintons created Trump, in the sense that they created this world of celebrity, billionaires, politicians are supposedly going to fix the whole world for us. And then along comes Donald Trump, and he's like, I'm all three. I'm a billionaire, a celebrity, you know, and I want to be president. And it's just like he's Clinton world come to life. So, I mean, I really believe that the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Global Initiative, it makes her incredibly vulnerable as a candidate and really impossible to get behind. And I mean, then there's I haven't even talked about the militarism, and I haven't talked about Palestine. So, I mean, I can't.
We could go there, but I'm going to take you back to Canada.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry.
So I want you to imagine you're sitting in front of the Trudeau cabinet. Here they are. What's your ask of them? One or two asks.
The asks. Well, you know, what I hope sort of getting at there, I think that this ask about the stimulus would be a really important place to start. You know, they're saying some good things about Indigenous rights. They're saying some good things about climate. They're saying some good things about job creation. There's no connection of the dots, right? So I think it's really about challenging them to have a coherent policy that draws the connections between all of this. So the ask is, how can you spend a cent of public money on fossil fuels when you have made a promise in Paris that I consider to be a sacred promise? I mean, this is what I was trying to get at in the talk, is like, you know, we are toying with people's very survival when we champion 1.5 and then turn around and say we want to build more pipelines. I mean, I think this is a huge crisis for this country. I think in many ways it is more troubling than what we were dealing with under Harper. So I don't know, this isn't like an ask exactly, but I've got a lot of asks from them.
Well, Zoya T at Globe, first question out to Trudeau was, how can we have Pipeline East when you've made 1.5 commitment? So
yeah, I mean,
he's
and
had
I think we need to hammer away at it.
Yeah.
And this is the thing is, I mean, like Bill McKibben on the last day of the Paris Summit, they said 1.5 and we're going to damn well hold them to it. And the fact is that this is a tool, and this is a tool we must use. So I hope that what I said did not come across as we can just ignore this. We can't ignore this. This is the only tool we have, you know? And these tools can, you know, even a non-binding international treaty can be powerful in the hands of a very mobilized population. This pledge was made. It was made in public. It was made in a way that was incredibly meaningful to a great many people. And we have a responsibility to hold them to it. And I believe we can. I believe it's possible.
One of the questions that came up, actually, it was a question that came up in many different forms from the Thais survey, and it says, is capitalism the problem, or is it an extreme version of capitalism that's the problem? And is it possible to have alternative economic models that draw on market principles that marry both social and ecological values to those?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think maybe those are different questions. Like so, is it capitalism that's the problem? So, or is it an extreme? I'm going to go to that one first. I think it really depends on your analysis of how capitalism evolves, right? So we entered into this sort of hyper-capitalist era with Reagan, Thatcher, earlier in other parts of the world. So why, right? Now you could tell a story that was just because a bunch of bad people took over, or you could tell a story that this was a way that capitalism corrects its own internal crises, that there was a crisis of growth within capitalism that needed new frontiers of expansion. And that's what neoliberalism provided. It provided the frontiers of the state. You can privatize everything and create a whole bunch of new billionaires that will then go to the Clinton Global Initiative and save the world, like Carlos Slim. And so, I mean, so I'm more in that category. So I don't believe neoliberalism was like a typo. I think neoliberalism was how capitalism evolved for the reason that this is a system that requires growth, infinite growth, and it reached a plateau and needed to evolve into neoliberalism. So I don't think we get to go back to Keynesianism just because we liked it better, right? And so, but in addition to that, I believe that we just have a crisis between extreme capitalism and climate change. I think that was true for a while, in that it was more that the neoliberal orthodoxies of privatization and deregulation and low taxes and trade deals that were clashing. But now we need to cut our emissions by 10% a year, and there isn't an economist in the world who can tell you how you can do that within a system built to pursue growth, which is capitalism, right? So you can reconcile marginal growth with marginal emission reductions, but you cannot reconcile radical emission reductions, which is what we need, with a system built to pursue growth at all costs. Now, if my brother Seth were here, but he's not because he's home babysitting my son and his kids, he would say that you shouldn't put growth front and center, because as we transition, there are going to be parts of our economy that are going to grow very rapidly, right? I mean, that's absolutely true for transit, for energy. There's huge investments, and there will be growth. But at the same time, there has to be contraction in consumption. There has to be contraction in those parts of our economy that are just encouraging mindless consumption, because of this problem that when you have a system that is built on fossil fuels, you're actually going to burn a lot of fossil fuels just to get off fossil fuels. So that's why you have to deal with contraction. So yes, I believe that there is a role for markets, and markets are very diverse and ancient, and we can have different kinds of markets than we have right now. So I'm not saying no markets, but I am saying that the role of entities whose sole goal is the pursuit of profit has to shrink in the mix of what else is in our economy. So there has to be an expansion of the commons, there has to be an expansion of the non-profit sectors, cooperative sectors. So that's more what I'm going for as a change in that mix.
So let's take that. You've got, on the one hand, there's the actions around divest, resist, blockade, blockadia. And on the other hand, you're talking about create more locally controlled renewable energy as an example. How do you bridge those? How do you get from the saying no to the creation? Is there a relationship and a negotiation with the state on that?
Well, first of all, the yes and the no, I mean, are interwoven and are happening on the ground. I mean, I mentioned the project that Melina has been powering in her community of Little Buffalo. There are so many examples of that, where frontline communities that have been saying no, fighting for their survival, have gotten to the point where they have to have a yes, right? And you have to have a yes because in so many of these communities, fossil fuel companies are the only ones who are offering jobs. So there has to be some kind of example that this is not the only model for some kind of economic, I don't use words like progress, but or even development, but some kind of possibilities and options and hope, right? So that's happening, but for it to happen fast enough, there does need to be an engagement with the state, and this is why I think the German example is a really good one, because it's an example of a national policy that was designed under pressure from social movements and within a parliamentary system that allows for a lot more give and take between left parties and the governing party in Germany, which is actually a center-right party. And in that push and pull, a feed-in tariff system was brought in that really encouraged decentralized and community ownership, right? And there's been a big battle within Germany's energy transition of whether or not it's going to be monopolized by big players who, or whether or not that we're going to protect this part of it, which has been the community-controlled, or what's increasingly called energy democracy. But the point is that what has allowed it to spread so quickly is that there's a law, there's a state law. So yeah, I mean, on our own, we can have our own community-controlled energy projects, but we're not going to lower emissions unless we have policy.
So not everyone probably feels comfortable blockading or marching. So one of the questions that came up time and time again is, how do you get beyond the converted? How do you create a critical mass to address serious climate action? And particularly, what messages work with, say, the middle class that may not necessarily have an analysis of capitalism or have the kind of analysis that you present in the book?
Well, you know, it's funny. I actually am not sure I agree with the premise in that, I mean, I actually think that one of the great failures of the environmental movement is that it's been too middle class and too white. I mean, I do think that. And so I think that the way that the message that doesn't, it's not just about it working in terms of like raising awareness, but working in the sense of building a movement that is powerful and engaged and committed enough to take on the most powerful industry in the world. And that is not going to happen until people see a vision for a society that isn't just better than apocalyptic warming, but is better than their present, that is better than their present reality. So that's why I say maybe it isn't about reaching the middle class, maybe it's about reaching the working class, maybe it's about reaching the unemployed, maybe it's about reaching the people who are getting the absolute worst deal in our current economy. And we assume that change isn't, and it's not to say that the middle class doesn't matter, it does, but I actually think that that is the constituency that the environmental movement has already reached. And that it isn't going to be until we chart a path that shows exactly how this is the best hope for living wage, unionized jobs, for services in the most underserved communities. And you know, I think that that's the most winning, most hopeful, most galvanizing message, that it's not just better than the world's going to end if we don't act, it's better than right now.
I have two personal questions. So the first question is, and it comes, I think, in a comment of appreciation, the extent to which you provide a space and amplify the messages of Indigenous women elders. How important has that community been, or those communities of women within the Indigenous community and broader within Aboriginal communities been in the formation of your thinking?
Well, I mean, I feel like I've been on a journey where, like, that the more I engage with this subject, the more it has led me to question, you know, everything I thought I knew. And you know, there was a question earlier, like, is it about capitalism? I think it is about capitalism, but it's about more than capitalism. I think we are experiencing a crisis of worldview, a crisis of narrative. And it's certainly the times that I've been privileged enough to spend in Indigenous communities where I've been exposed to another worldview that is not based on a Judeo-Christian narrative of domination and separation from the earth, of humans as apart and separate from all of living, of the rest of the world. Or a view of the earth as a machine, that I've been able to sort of see, you know, what we could have instead, the worldview instead, and I think that it's, you know, I think there can be a danger in, you know, fetishizing Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge, because, you know, the truth is that you know, all humans on Earth used to know that the Earth was alive, and that living systems we should approach with a healthy dose of fear as well as respect. And so, yeah, but I think that I've been pushed into areas that, you know, are beyond my comfort zone. You know, I'm not somebody who writes and talks about spirituality so much. And so that exposure and that learning and those teachings have been really, really important to me. And I think for us in this moment, you know, where we are talking about truth and reconciliation in this country, that we really, you know, I think we need to go way beyond the parameters of where that discussion is at right now. And I was lucky to be part of a discussion in Kamloops hosted by Arthur Manuel about Indigenous communities in climate change a few weeks ago and heard from a lot of elders about how much they feel that what is needed is exposure to an Indigenous worldview by the rest of Canada, because they see it as our only hope of actually making the changes that are necessary in the face of the climate crisis. And so I think that that's something that we, like in this moment where we're talking about reinventing public institutions, we need to be thinking, about what is the CBC's role in that? What is the public university's role in that? How do we really change our worldview and change ourselves? Because it isn't just about changing, our light bulbs and our cars. It's deeper than that.
This is my last question, unfortunately. I feel like there are dozens more, but it is a question. It's one of those personal I would call a softball question, but a question that came up time and time again. And I think it's important, particularly for women, to know that you've got the courage to stand up, and that you have stood up, and you've been criticized. You've gone through periods where the right has taken and waxed, and that doesn't seem to faze you. Where does that come from?
Practice.
What sustains it?
It's funny. It used to get to me more, there is something about just sheer volume. I think we added up at the National Post. How many stories had they run attacking the Leap? 24? 30. And they refused to publish our one letter to the editor correcting. So I think that I think part of it is just from kind of studying history and realizing that, my God, there's a lot at stake. I mean, I hate to use military metaphors, but it's a war, and it has real casualties. And whatever attacks I've received from, assholes online, I mean, an amazing leader in Honduras last week named Berta Cáceres was assassinated in her home, and she was at the forefront of protecting her land from a massive hydroelectric dam. There's Indigenous people around the world who are being assassinated for land protection work, and in this country, when Indigenous people protect their land and blockade, the attacks that they're under are, makes the kind of whatever I've experienced so nothing, and this is, in a position of extraordinary privilege from where I'm speaking. And I mean, I think part of the privilege that I also have is that I grew up in a political family. My mother was named Hustler's Asshole of the Month when I was 10 years old. And
Tell us who your mother is. For those of us who knew the early NFB, please tell us who your mother is.
My mother is Bonnie Scher Klein, and she made porno films. No, it wasn't. That's what people said at my school. She made a film called Not a Love Story, which, so my mom was called, I remember, but I remember, it was funny, I was thinking about my mom the other day because I was speaking at a women's conference, and they asked me to speak personally, which I hate, as you can see. But it's funny, I was just writing down a few recollections, and I remembered that the Globe and Mail called my mother a bourgeois feminist fascist in a headline, and it was 30 years later that I got called a fascist in the Globe and Mail for supporting BDS. So there you go.
Thank you. Anne's just...
Thank you so much to Naomi and Shauna one more time. Thank you for that time of discussion. Hi, my name is Am Johal with SFU's Van City Office of Community Engagement. I want to thank you so much for joining us on a Friday night. And the evening actually isn't over. We're going to be back here at 9 p.m. screening the documentary that's based on Naomi's book. Naomi will also be on the second floor signing her books, and importantly, there will be a bar in the basement that'll be open as well. I want to do a quick thank you to SFU Public Square team, Janet Weber and team who produced this event.
Naomi?
The SFU Philosophy Department and SFU Vancouver, and a special shout out to the SFU Semester and Dialogue students who are also here in full force. Thank you. So see you in about 15 minutes back here, and also join Naomi up on the second floor. Take care.